Hi gang, Blood Bowl, the game of fantasy football, is just about to get yet another edition, the latest in a long line of releases stretching all the way back to the 80s. But as everyone knows, that stretch was broken up by a long period in which Games Workshop hated the game, a period where they discontinued it and where it was only kept alive by the dedication of the fans. At least that's the story. But is that actually what happened? Wanna buy some merch? Well, I've got no sports teams, but a link to my fancy frog shirt is in the thing below. Blood Bowl is one of Games Workshop's oldest and most enduringly popular games, and arguably one of their best written game systems. A game of comedy fantasy football set in a particularly silly version of the Warhammer Fantasy world. The game has been in near constant publication in one form or another since its introduction in 1986. But I say near constant because there is a bit of a gap in there. Any newcomer to Blood Bowl has heard the story, retold by countless aging coaches of the dark times, the years of neglect when Blood Bowl, clearly the best and most popular Warhammer game, was unfairly thrown to the curb by its maker, Games Workshop, cast aside and ignored for years, no, for decades, no, for centuries, and only kept alive by the dedication of the fans, who kept on playing, kept on writing rules, and kept on supporting it until eventually they forced Games Workshop to admit their error and re-release it, thereby proving the fans right all along. Yes, stirring stuff, right? But is that actually what happened? What is the story of Blood Bowl, and was it really only kept going by its fans? Well, handily, on this video, someone else has already figured it out. My friend Gary, who will be familiar to anyone who watches our Tale of Four Gamers series, is a massive Blood Bowl fan. It's by far his favourite game, and he has multiples of many of the teams, often from different eras of the game. And whenever he sees someone on a forum or on social media pining about the days when the fan base kept the game alive, he posts this, a copy-paste he calls the 5,000 Years of Neglect, inspired by this old meme. The 5,000 Years of Neglect is a list of all Blood Bowl releases since the first edition of the game, so everyone can see how many years in the wilderness there really were. So in this video, I'm stealing it, and I'm going to use it as a basis for a history of Blood Bowl, to put to rest the years of neglect, and also so that Gary can just post a link to this video when he fancies trolling people in the future. The very first edition of Blood Bowl was released in 1986 in this modest, slim box format containing a puzzle-style cardboard pitch and two teams of cardboard standees, though there were a few metal miniatures produced alongside it. Written by Jervis Johnson, in fact this game is very much his baby, the rules were broadly similar to the Warhammer Fantasy Battle rules of the time and a lot more complex than they would eventually become, but the game was pretty popular, and so in 1988 a second edition was released, in a version that would become a lot more familiar to Games Workshop customers, a big box game. Second edition featured two teams of plastic miniatures, orcs and humans, and came with a polystyrene pitch with the squares marked with little grooves, and had a big rule shake-up. And it was so popular it was followed by a 1989 alternate version of the game, Dungeon Bowl, which came with elf and dwarf teams and relocated the game onto a cardboard dungeon corridor map. There was also two books of extra rules released for this version, 1989's Star Players and 1990's Blood Bowl Companion. But the one I remember playing a lot as a kid is this one. Blood Bowl 3rd edition was released in 1993, and it had a massively slimmed down rule set. In fact, a rule set very similar to the one still used today, and it came with specialist block dice, a cardboard folding pitch and dugouts, and two plastic teams for humans and orcs, this time with different models to represent the different positions. This version was massively popular. It spawned a box set supplement, Death Zone, in 1994, which had rules for more teams, a league system, and special play cards, and the game was continually supported through the 90s by boxed metal team releases and articles in White Dwarf and the Citadel Journal. For me, this was the golden age of Blood Bowl, and it also saw the property move out of tabletop gaming for the first time. 1995 saw the release of the first Blood Bowl video game, developed by Destiny Software Productions for MS-DOS. So, that's all very simple. 4th edition is where it starts getting a bit complicated. Generally, by the early 2000s, Games Workshop had started to concentrate on their 2 biggest games, Warhammer Fantasy Battle and Warhammer 40k, and all those other 90s big box games started to be moved into the background, first into a specialist games studio, and then into digital formats, and then eventually, though it would take a while, discontinued altogether. But from all of those games, Blood Bowl probably received the most support. The 4th edition rules for Blood Bowl were debuted in 2000 in the official Blood Bowl magazine issues 1 and 2, but there was quite a lot of backlash as they weren't very well thought out. Jervis later admitted that maybe they hadn't been play tested as well as they could have been. So over the next couple of years, the rules were slowly amended back to something that resembled 3rd edition a lot more. And this culminated with the release of 4th edition Gold in 2001, which was rolled into a re-released box set in 2002. So this was 4th edition. But in play, it actually played a lot like 3rd edition. In order to manage all those updates, Jervis had formed the Blood Bowl Rules Committee, a group of fans and Games Workshop staff who helped him with the updates and play tested everything. And in this form, the game moved into the digital era with a series of living rulebooks. Lots of games got these. These were free digital downloads available on Games Workshop's official Blood Bowl website and occasionally on the Specialist Games website, whichever website was up at the time. And the Blood Bowl ones were updated every year or two with input from the Rules Committee. The first living rulebook was available in 2002, and new editions were released in 2003, 2004, 2005, and 2006, before being consolidated into a final competition rules pack in 2009, all available as digital downloads. As well as the tabletop game, this was also the prime era of Black Library, so we got 4 novels in the same period: Blood Bowl, Deathmatch, Rumble in the Jungle, and Killer Contract. And at the end of this period, there's another Blood Bowl video game, developed this time by Cyanide and released in 2009 for PC, Xbox, Nintendo DS, and PSP. After that, things get a bit shaky. 2009 was the last release of a digital rule set, and 2002 had been the last release of a starter box, but I have no date for when the starter box went out of print. The last new metal teams were released during the 5th edition of the Living Rulebook, and by all accounts, specific teams and models continued to be produced in metal until 2013, when metal was retired by Games Workshop in favour of resin. And when that happened, Blood Bowl models stopped being made, and around the same time, it seems that essential elements like the block dice also stopped being sold in the store. The starter box definitely went a few years before that. After 2013, there is definitely a period where Games Workshop did not publish anything to do with the game, but by then it was pretty well served by a third-party market, ever since the rise of online manufacturers in the early 2000s, which coincided with the slow sidelining of the game by Games Workshop. A pretty big industry had grown up, offering alternative dice, pitches, and teams. Blood Bowl was actually one of the first games to be served by third-party sculptors, and some fantastic and, of course, extremely questionable teams were released in this period. And for a time at least, they would be the only source of Blood Bowl material, but the period of no support at all didn't last that long. The Cyanide video game had continued to be updated, including with updates that brought the rules into line with the competition rule pack and ported it over to some mobile formats, and in 2015, Blood Bowl 2 was released, available on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox, and soon after came the announcement of a new version of the box game. After Games Workshop's big restructuring and management changes, Blood Bowl was the first of the old specialist games to be reintroduced, announced in 2015 and released in early 2016 with a whole new box set with a slightly larger pitch and new plastic teams, and since then it's been in constant publication. Rules update almanacs were released in 2017, 2018 and 2019, supported by some re-releases of the novels and a new tie-in comic series, More Guts, More Glory. Another new edition was released in 2020, this time featuring the new Imperial Nobles team, and since then various new teams have been released, supported by issues of Spike magazine for the rules and then annual almanacs, and this was so successful that even old game variants came back. A new Death Zone supplement reintroduced the rules for Blood Bowl 7s, Dungeon Bowl was released in 2022 as a standalone box game again, and Gutter Bowl as a 2023 book, and the video game also got a third version in 2022. And that kind of brings us up to date, with 2025 seeing the planned release of the next full edition. So that's the release history of Blood Bowl as a game that, I will say again, has been in near constant publication of some sort for well over 30 years. But of course, what that cold description misses out on is the drama. During the digital era, things did tend to get a bit confusing. First, a game going online only in 2002 was obviously a bigger issue than it would be now. This is pre-smartphone and pre-apps, so it certainly felt more like the game had been sidelined, even if it was still getting updates and people could still download it. At the other end of that era, the gap between the 5th and 6th editions of the Living Rulebook was quite long, I think 3 years, and other teams had been play-tested, intended to be included in the 6th, but then they weren't included in the 6th. So there ended up being fan-made versions of those books floating around where some, but not all the rules had been changed. And then when 6th was released, and then quickly renamed the Competition Rule Pack, it didn't include those new teams either. One of them was a SLAN team, which Games Workshop never made anyway. So you had this situation where various people were playing with various versions of basically house rules in official-looking formats, some of which had been play-tested by official groups, but then not officially incorporated. It was a little bit much. And of course, the player base that were involved in all these changes was split across a lot of different forums. The NAF, the Nuffle Armorical Football Association, named after a body from the lore of the game, had formed in 2003, near the start of the digital rulebook era. Operating from their own forums, they were one of the main sources of Blood Bowl community chat, and they also provided ranking and tournament results. One of the first Warhammer groups to ever do this, though they didn't write any rules. That was the Blood Bowl Rules Committee. But the NAF continued to this day, which means they outlasted the official Blood Bowl forums and the Blood Bowl Rules Committee, and they've continued to be a community resource all the way through. A lot of the time when people tell the story of the 5,000 years of neglect, they credit NAF with having saved the game for everybody. But that doesn't mean they're free of controversy either. And all organisations like that do tend to overstate their importance. Realistically, by the end of the digital era, by the late 2000s, forums were dying out anyway in favour of social media, so the vast majority of the community had switched to things like Facebook groups, which you could also credit with keeping the game alive. All of this leads to two very different stories being possible, depending on how you interpret all this. On one hand, Blood Bowl is a story about how Games Workshop cast aside one of their best games, not releasing a new starter set for 14 years and consigning it to digital only, which obviously doesn't count as a real release, and it was only the NAF who saved Blood Bowl, providing a dedicated community that kept the game going until Games Workshop realised their terrible mistake. And on the other hand, Blood Bowl's a game that's been in publication in one form or another since 1986, either as a board game or through digital download or supported by a load of licensed products, with the exception of a brief period between mid-2013, when the metal models and dice were taken off sale by Games Workshop, to mid-2015, when a new edition was announced, and even in that gap there were a load of video game releases. Blood Bowl would be the first of the old specialist games to be re-released following Games Workshop's change of management, and it was the forerunner for a number of smaller skirmish-style games that we've seen in the last decade. And while it's tempting to say that this was because of the existing community, I think it's just as likely to be because, well, it's low risk, right? Blood Bowl was relatively self-contained, the box doesn't require too much in terms of models, and subsequent releases could be scaled up or down based on how successful it was, which is perfect for a company who wanted to reintroduce the idea of smaller games after a decade and a half concentrating on their three big ones. Every game, to a degree, is kept alive by its players, including the ones that are constantly in publication. If no one bought the game, if it didn't build a community, it would be discontinued. And Blood Bowl certainly has a very dedicated community, one that seems to be only growing now that it's back in the release cycle. But realistically, it's kind of been available to players for all but 2 of the last 39 years. If we want to see a game that's really been kept alive at the fans, have a look at Mordheim or Battlefleet Gothic. One of Blood Bowl's enduring strengths is just how easy it is to support. And while the fan community have certainly built up the game over the decades, the 5,000 years of neglect is probably a bit of an over-exaggeration. Anyway, that's the history of Blood Bowl. I would say one of the most enduringly successful of Games Workshop's games. Almost 40 years in publication with a rule set that's been pretty solid for at least 35 of those. It is a staggering achievement, and if this video does nothing else, it will at least make Gary's troll posts a bit shorter next time. Thanks for watching! And if you'd like to support the channel, there's loads of merch you can buy, or you can like and subscribe, or you can join us on Patreon or the YouTube membership scheme. All the usual links are in the thing below. See ya!